Good morning, everybody. Just a couple of quick things before we get started today. Um, we are doing chapter 19, which is Drifting Towards Disunion in the book that starts on page 296. I hope that you're all doing well and you had a good week. We have assignments that are due. Some of you just started doing them because I've been contacting your parents, so that is a good thing. But you need to be doing them. Let's see here. You're going to have a test that's available for chapters 16 through 18. That's going to be posted within the next day or two. And so you need to get that test done. There is no review for the test. You've already gotten all of the questions that you're going to see on the test. I'm only going to pick about maybe 10 or 15 questions. You've seen them all before. If you've been doing your weekly assignments, hint, hint. The test for dual credit students is going to be on Blackboard, and that's a non-negotiable. You have to go to Blackboard to do those assignments. Everybody else, your test will be on Google Classroom. With that being said, we're going to do this chapter in one sitting. The slideshow is only about 40 slides long, so it should be about a minute it should be about an hour's long of a presentation. If there's something that I don't go into a lot of detail on, it's because I'm planning to post a video down in the description, so make sure you're checking that stuff out. And if it's something that I don't go into detail on and it's something that you still have a question about, make sure you hit me up with an email. That being said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, Chapter 19, Drifting Toward Disunion, 1854 to 1861. The quote at the beginning of this chapter is a quote from Abraham Lincoln, probably one of his most famous quotes, from 1858. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. So Abraham Lincoln is talking about the state of events in the country at the time when he was running for senator for the state of Illinois and lost against Stephen Douglas. Later on, 2 years later to be exact, he would run for president and be at the helm of that disunion. So the slavery question continued to churn, and it was a cauldron of controversy throughout the 1850s. In the last chapter, with the election of Zachary Taylor, it was mentioned that it was kind of like a second era of good feelings. No, it wasn't the election of Zachary Taylor. I'm sorry. It was the election after Zachary Taylor with President Franklin Pierce. It was seen as a second era of good feelings because there was no other opposition party. The Whigs had pretty much died out. We had a compromise in 1850 to keep the country churning forward again, and kind of put the slave issue on the back burner a little bit. But the morality question of slavery kept on getting bigger, and temperatures rose, and the prospects of a peaceful resolution between the political North and the political South over the issue of slavery evaporated away. Within a couple years of the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas territory would erupt in violence over the issue of free soil versus slavery under the popular sovereignty of the 1850 Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. A couple years later, a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott decision would forever invalidate the legitimacy of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So, in that 8-year time period from the time of the second era of good feelings to the beginning of the Civil War, a whole brand new political party emerges, one which we still have today, and the stage will be set for an all-out civil war. You should recognize some of these questions. They're the focus questions from page 296 in your book, so I won't go into too much questioning about them. And here is the chronology that is on page 297 in your book as well. Alright, so let's talk about some books that really helped start the fire of the Civil War. In 1852, a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book dramatized the horrors of slavery, and it really woke up people in the North as to what the wickedness of slavery was really about. She was dismayed by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, and she was determined to show people the terrible inhumanity of what slavery looked like, especially when families were split up for sale. She relied on powerful imagery and touching pathos to get people to see the inhumane nature of slavery. And when later asked about it, she said that God wrote it. That she had said that her deep anti-slavery sentiments laid in the religious crusades of the Second Great Awakening. Now, the success of this book would be like a sold-out blockbuster movie today. There were hundreds of thousands of copies of this book published in its first year alone, and that book then ran into the millions. It was sold out. It was translated into over 20 languages. For American literature, like we think of Moby Dick, we think of A Scarlet Letter and other books from this time period as being American novels, but we forget about Uncle Tom's Cabin as being a distinctly American novel because it's uncomfortable to talk about. It's uncomfortable to talk about slavery in a post-slave world. But no other novel in American history can be compared with it as a political force. It made the issue of slavery political. It made it appear as evil as it really was. And it reinforced people to strengthen their convictions against nullifying the fugitive slave law, of not turning in slaves who were escaping to the North, and even helping runaway slaves in their trip to the North. This tale was devoured by millions of impressionable youths in the 1850s, many of whom probably later donned the blue uniform of the Civil War and fought for the Union to free Uncle Tom from the chains of slavery in the book. Several years later, in 1863, Harriet Beecher Stowe actually got to meet Abraham Lincoln, and when Lincoln met Stowe, the quote was that, so this is the little lady who wrote that book that made this great war. And Lincoln definitely tied the two things together of the, and as it says here, the greatest book of the age. There was another book also in 1857, not the literary giant of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it was this book called The Impending Crisis of the South, written by a Southerner in 1857. Now, Hinton Helper, he was a non-aristocratic white from North Carolina. He not only hated slavery, but he also hated blacks too. So it wasn't like he was an abolitionist per se because of the mistreatment of blacks. But what Helper did see was that, or what he stated was that it was the non-slaveholding whites who were the ones who suffered most from slavery because of the economic holdback that slavery held on the South. That things were not going to industrialize as long as the millstone of slavery was around the necks of the South. It was influential enough to be banned in the South, and his book was added to the flames of burn piles of book burning parties. And parts of his book were taken and distributed as campaign literature by the Republicans in the 1860 election. Now let's talk about the North-South contest for Kansas. Now, the other day we were talking about how all of that territory in the old Louisiana Purchase, except for Missouri, was shut off from slavery. That was the terms of the 1820 Missouri Compromise. In 1850, that changed with a new compromise that allowed territories to make their own determination as to whether they would be free or slave, which is called popular sovereignty. Kansas is the worst possible example of the workings of popular sovereignty. Most of the Northerners who were moving into Kansas were just westward moving pioneers. There was a group that was financed by a company called the New England Immigrant Aid Company that were actually financed by Northern abolitionists. They sent 2,000 people into the territory specifically to forestall the South. Because remember, whoever showed up first and voted, that was going to be the future of the territory. So this company, they actually equipped all of their settling families with the brand new breech loading Sharps rifle. And I'll include a video in the description of just how what a game changer the Sharps rifle was compared to other rifles of the time period. And those were actually called Beecher's Bibles, named after Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, who was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, all these free soilers moved into Nebraska, much to the chagrin of the Southerners. So, this slide right here is talking about how Southern spokesman cried betrayal on the whole Kansas-Nebraska thing. It had been a scheme by Northern Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. There was an unspoken understanding that Kansas would become a slave state and Nebraska would become a free state. And that was one of the things that got the act or the compromise to pass in the first place. So Southerners called the Northerners Nebraskals, who planned to abolitionize both to make both Kansas and Nebraska a free state, or free states instead of a slave state and a free state. Southern hotheads attempted to assist groups of slave owners, but the simple truth is that slavery never took hold in Kansas. A census that was held in 1860 found that there were only 2 slaves living in all the 107,000 people living in the Nebraska Territory. And there were actually 15 slaves in Nebraska. So there were actually more slaves in Nebraska than there were in Kansas in 1860. But the crisis conditions in Kansas worsened. In 1855, the first territorial legislature was elected. And by elected, really there should be quotation marks around this elected right here. Because Southerners, slaveholding Southerners from Missouri, would rush into Kansas and they would vote fraudulently in the Kansas election as if they were living there. And they swayed the election to the point where they got to set up their own government. The Free Soilers, who saw this as being an illegitimate election, went and established their own extra-legal government in another part of the state. In 1856, the pro-slavery raiders shot up and burned part of the free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas. Here's a map right here. This is how close Missouri is to Kansas. Okay, you got a Kansas City right here on the Missouri side of the border. Southerners or slaveholder ruffians would rush over into Kansas and vote fraudulently in the elections, and they set up their own government here at Shawnee Mission. And then here are some other battles that happened in the whole time period of Bleeding Kansas. Now we talk about John Brown. The first time we talk about John Brown in this chapter. The fanatical figure of John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. He was an radical abolitionist who wanted to make it into a fight. He was spare, he was gray-headed, he was iron-willed, and he was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. After hearing about the attack on Lawrence, he went and hacked to pieces 5 pro-slavery people that he presumed to be pro-slaverites. His butchery brought vicious retaliation from pro-slavery forces and escalated the situation in Kansas. From 1856 until the beginning of the Civil War, there was already a civil war happening in Kansas. In 1857, pro-slavery intensified the conflict when the pro-slavery forces attempted to bring Kansas into the United States under something called the Lecompton Constitution. Although the majority of Kansans were free soilers, the vote on the proposed constitution was arranged so that it was impossible to prohibit all black bondage and still obtain statehood. The Free Soilers boycotted the election, and so the pro-slaverites approved the Constitution and presented it to Congress as their Constitution to be brought into the United States. In fact, President James Buchanan threw his weight behind the Lecompton Constitution. He was just as much influenced by Southerners as his predecessor Franklin Pierce had been. But Stephen Douglas comes to his senses. Now, Senator Stephen Douglas was the person who championed the idea of popular sovereignty and got the country into the situation that it was in with Kansas and Nebraska. Remember, because he wanted to have a railway built through his state. So Douglas actually fought to submit the entire Lecompton Constitution to a fair popular vote, that the Constitution would have to stand up for a full vote of the people of Kansas for it to be legitimate. And with the Free Soilers seeing their opportunity to get rid of it, they snowed it under at the polls and voted against it. And Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when it was brought into Congress after all the Southern secessionists left. With his support of the Lecompton Constitution and bringing Kansas in as a slave state, President Buchanan hopelessly divided the powerful Democratic Party and officially ended that era of good feelings, that second era of good feelings for the Democrats, and would lead to disastrous results for the Democrats in the 1860 election. But while Kansas is erupting in warfare, there are other battles happening as well. In 1856, Bleeding Kansas was the topic that spattered blood on the floor of the Senate. There was an abolitionist Senator, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who delivered a blistering speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas." And in that speech, he condemned people who were pro-slavery and even had insults in there against Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, who was a very revered elder statesman from the state of South Carolina. Sumner's speech included things like hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. And it ticked some people off. A South Carolina congressman named Preston S. Brooks, who was actually a relative of Butler's, decided to take vengeance into his own hands. And on May 22nd, 1856, at the end of the day in the Senate chambers, like there weren't very many senators still around, Brooks approached Sumner, who was working on some paperwork at his desk. Sumner was trapped underneath his desk. He couldn't get up to address Brooks, and before Sumner could react, Brooks beat the ever-living snot out of Charles Sumner with an 11-ounce cane and continued beating him until the cane broke. Sumner fell bleeding and unconscious on the floor of the Senate. He actually was grievously injured. He had injuries to his head and to his nervous system, and he wouldn't be well again for about 3 years after this. Brooks was ejected from Congress. He goes home and he's a hero in his home state of South Carolina, and he's reelected to Congress the next election. Sumner is also reelected by the people of Massachusetts, but once again, he wouldn't be able to fill his seat again until his injuries healed 3 years later. This is the picture that's in your book on page 301, talking about the beating of Senator Sumner. So let's talk about an election. In 1856, the Democrats nominate James Buchanan as their presidential candidate. He's not really that impressive of a politician. He was a Pennsylvania lawyer and diplomat. He had been outside of the country during the whole Kansas-Nebraska uproar of 1850, and therefore his name wasn't tainted by being involved in that whole ordeal. His Kansas-less neutrality made him acceptable to the party. Republicans, by the way, the Republican Party now exists. The Republicans choose John C. Fremont, who was the explorer slash soldier slash surveyor who had gone and started the California Revolution during the time of the Mexican-American War and had liberated California from Mexico. and he was known as the Pathfinder of the West. He vigorously condemned the extension of slavery into the territories, and that became a party issue of the Republicans. Also in this campaign, anti-foreignism was injected into the campaign because of the recent influx of Germans and Irish into the country. And so Protestant nativists were alarmed by the rising influx, especially of Catholics into the country. And so in this election, the so-called Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, came into being with the slogan that Americans must rule America. In this election, Buchanan won handedly. Buchanan had a 174 to 114 victory in the Electoral College. The popular vote was a bit closer. It was only about 600,000 votes difference between the two candidates. And the Republicans saw this as a victorious defeat. For being a brand new party, one which did not exist in the previous election, the Republicans had gotten the number 2 spot in the election, showing astonishing results against the well-oiled Democratic machine. And so they cast a long-shadowed question at the election of 1860. All right, let's talk about Dred Scott v. Stanford. This is one of those wise moments of the Supreme Court. I say wise with quotation marks because it is another stepping stone to Civil War. In March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court decided on the Dred Scott v. Stanford case. Now, Dred Scott was a black slave, and he sued for his freedom because he had lived for 5 years in free states of Illinois and Wisconsin Territory. He sued for his freedom on the basis of his long residence on free soil itself. So technically, he couldn't have been a slave on those free soil. The Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, Scott was a slave, not a citizen, and therefore he could not sue in federal courts, and that the court could have thrown out the case on technical grounds in and of itself. Like, your cow can't sue the farmer for milking it too often. Okay? He's not a citizen, he's a slave. He is property of the owner. And so the court actually didn't have to hear the case at all. They could have just thrown it out. But they went a step further. Chief Justice Taney wrote the majority opinion for this case. And in that opinion, he wrote that because a slave was private property, he could be taken into any territory and held there in slavery. So, if you think about that for a second, that means that any state, even Massachusetts, could be a slave state. Maine, Illinois, all of those could be slave states. Taney went on to say that the Fifth Amendment forbade Congress from depriving people of their property without due process of law, and therefore he goes a step further and says that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional because Congress had no power to ban slavery regardless of what territorial legislators might want. So boom, 50 years, 30 years of compromise is gone in the blink of an eye with this decision by the Supreme Court. Southerners were delighted by this victory. the Southerners had a majority on the Supreme Court to begin with, and popular sovereignty advocates were aghast by its decision. On top of that, there was an economic panic in 1857, which severely impacted the North because of the economic downturn in the economy, whereas the South, because it was mostly agrarian, rode out the storm. Its cotton prices were still good in England and in Europe, so they continued to make money while the Northerners were suffering in 1857. The financial distress of the Panic of 1857 put the North, put Congress into a position where they had to start thinking of a way to put out free farms for the public domain, all that federal land out west. So in 1860, Congress passes the Homestead Act, which is going to be pivotal in populating the West in the second half of this book, of drawing immigrants and farmers out of the congested eastern United States and distributing them across Nebraska and Kansas and Wyoming and Idaho and all the other Midwest states. Also, there was a tariff in 1857 that was part of that economic panic. The tariff was lowered to about 20%, which is probably one of the lowest tariff rates of all the first half of the 1800s. And that, again, disrupted manufacturing in the North because now it was cheaper to bring in English-made and European-made goods than to buy American-made goods. And so northern manufacturers clamored for a higher tariff rate to increase the protection of their product. Those two events, the Panic of 1857 and the Panic of 1857, gave Republicans two surefire economic issues for the 1860 election: protection for the unprotected and farms for the farmless. So let's talk about the emergence of Abraham Lincoln into national politics. Lincoln, who we briefly met in the Mexican-American War chapter, had already been to Washington once before as a one-term congressman from 1847 to 1849. In 1858, he decides to run for senator of the state of Illinois because Senator Stephen Douglas's term was about to expire, and Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln to run against him in the 1858 election. Now, Lincoln was quite a bit different from most politicians of the time. He was not a silver spoon child of the elite. He was not born in a fine house with fancy clothes. He was not born with a quote-unquote silver spoon in his mouth. He was an avid reader, and he was mainly self-educated. There's, folk tales of him walking in the snow for miles to check out a book from a friend of the family or from school that he could read by the fire of his log cabin as a child. He emerged as one of the better known trial lawyers in Illinois, where he got to that position completely through self-education. He was a wrestler and a weightlifter in his younger days. He became known as a rail splitter because of his ability of taking an axe and splitting fence rails for farmsteads and doing it quite avidly. He emerged as one of the foremost politicians and orators of the Northwest. And so because of that, shh, Stasia, sit. Because of his oratory skill, he emerged in these so-called Lincoln-Douglas debates in the fall of, that should be 1858, sorry about that, of 1858. Where his most famous debate was at Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln poses what came to be called the Freeport question. Suppose the people of a territory should vote slavery down. The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision had decreed that they could not do so, so who would prevail, the court or the people? Douglas's reply came to be known as the Freeport Doctrine, that no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if the people voted it down, and that the laws to protect slavery would have to be passed by territorial legislatures. Those laws would not be forthcoming in the absence of popular approval. Therefore, slavery would disappear. Lincoln lost that 1858 election for the Senate. People's loyalty to the idea of popular sovereignty was decisive in the decision. But Douglas's chances of winning the presidency were hurt. His opposition to the Compton Constitution and the defiance of the Southern Court at Freeport led to Southern Democrats not willing to support him in the 1860 election. This also put a national limelight on Lincoln. The upshot here is that Lincoln doesn't get the Senate seat. He becomes a leading Northern spokesman for the Republican Party and a potential Republican nominee for president. All right, John Brown, Part 2, Murder or Martyr. So, John Brown, after he got done in Bleeding, Kansas, studied the tactics of black rebels Nat Turner and Toussaint Louverture of Haiti. And he hatched a scheme to invade the South and secretly with a handful of followers. And once he got to the South, he would call on slaves to rise up, furnish them with arms, and establish a black free state. But to do that, he needs weapons and money. He gets several $1,000s for firearms from Northern abolitionists, and he goes down into the hilly Western Virginia town of Harper's Ferry with about 20 men, most of them his own sons and family. And in October 1859, he seizes the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and kills 7 people in the process. Incidentally, including a free black. But the slaves failed to rise. They failed to come out of the woodwork, get the weapons, and rise up and be free. And so John Brown's rebellion was quickly put under when U.S. Marines, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, captured them. Brown was captured and convicted of murder and treason. And he was clever here to see that his worth was much more to the abolitionist cause dangling from a hangman's rope than in any other way. And so he's executed by the federal government for this raid on Harper's Ferry, but his name becomes nationally known. His sacrifice for the abolitionist cause becomes nationally known. In the South, Brown was a wholesale murderer and an apostle of treason. but abolitionists saw him as a saint. Here's a portrait from page 305 in the book of the last moments of John Brown as he's being taken out of the jail, and he's kissing a black baby. Sentenced to be hanged, John Brown wrote to his brother, "I am quite cheerful in view of my approaching end, being fully persuaded that I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose. I count it all joy." So the Democrats are divided leading up to the 1860 election. The presidential election of 1860 was the most fateful in American history. Northern Democrats looked to Douglas as a leading candidate, but Southern fire eaters held Douglas as a traitor because of that Freeport decision in the Illinois debates. Delegates from most of the Cotton states walked out of this Democratic convention, and the remainder could not scrape together the two-thirds vote for Douglas, and so the entire body dissolved. That convention departure was the first tragic act of secession. The Democrats tried again. The Northern Douglas Democrats enthusiastically nominated their hero, and once again the Southern Democrats took a walk. The Southern Democrats then organized their own rival convention where they selected John C. Breckinridge to be their party candidate. The platform that the Southern Democrats stood for election on was an extension of slavery into the territories and the annexation of slave-populated Cuba into the United States. A constitutional party, or a constitutional union party, was organized for a middle-of-the-road group where they nominated John Bell for the presidency. As its platform, the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of law, which is like a terrible, bland party slogan. And that left the Republicans out there as they watched all their opponents split away from each other. Initially, William Seward was the best known of the contenders for the Republican ticket, but Lincoln was a stronger candidate. The Republican platform had appeal for every important non-Southern group: free soilers, manufacturers, immigrants, farmers, and the returns proclaimed a sweeping victory for Lincoln. Very decisive election here. Lincoln had a popular vote of 1,865,000. Lincoln was only elected, his percentage of the popular vote was only 40% of the country. But he gained 180 electoral votes. None of the other candidates even got over 75 electoral votes because they had split up amongst themselves. The secessionists served notice that the election of Lincoln would split the Union. Lincoln was a minority president. 60% of the voters preferred some other candidate. Like 60% of the population in 1860 voted against Lincoln. And he was a sectional president. In 10 southern states, he polled no popular votes. Nobody voted for Lincoln in the South. Southerners still controlled the Supreme Court, both houses of Congress, and enough states to block any constitutional amendment. So they didn't have to leave. The South still held a pretty strong control of Congress. Here's the presidential election of 1860. You can see the divided nature of things. And when you look at it in a county-by-county basis, here how divided up the South is between Breckenridge and Bell, and how divided up the North is between Douglas and Lincoln in some parts. Here is the election results that I was referencing from page 307. Lincoln only gets 40% of the total popular vote. And here is a map of Southern opposition to secession. You can see here that there are pockets of resistance against secession in every state except for North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas. There is, opposition to secession, mostly in these non-slave holding areas of the mountains. But the chain reaction of secession began. South Carolina had threatened to leave the United States if that Illinois baboon was elected. In December of 1860, a special convention was called by the legislature, and they voted to secede from the Union. During the next 6 weeks, 6 other states of the lower South followed South Carolina: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. 4 more joined later, bringing the total to 11 seceded states. In February of 1861, the newly formed Confederate States of America chose Jefferson Davis as their president, and the crisis deepened by the lame duck interlude of President Buchanan leaving office and Lincoln not taking office until March 4th, 1861. Buchanan could have sent troops into the South and could have stopped secession from happening, but he instead found constitutional and practical justifications for inaction, believing that fighting would shatter all prospects of adjustment. The weaknesses in the Constitution and in the Union itself laid bare for the world to see. The final and frantic attempts at compromise came when Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed the Crittenden Amendments to the Congress. They were designed to appease the South. They would prohibit slavery in the territories north of 3630, so that would be the old Missouri Compromise line, and would give federal protection south of 3630 in all territories that existed or, quote, to be acquired future states that would come into the Union with or without slavery. Lincoln rejected the Crittenden scheme because he was elected on a platform that opposed the extension of slavery. Now, Lincoln, you have to understand here that Lincoln wasn't necessarily an anti-slave president. He wasn't elected to destroy slavery. He was elected to stop the extension of it. There's a famous quote of Lincoln's, I think it's in the next chapter, but it talks about how if he could reunite the country without freeing a single slave, he would do it. And if he could reunite the country and free all the slaves, he would do that too. Because ultimately it was the task of reuniting the country that Lincoln was after. It was also feared that larger gains for slavery might come later in Cuba and Latin America, and that the Crittenden scheme would enshrine those places. Here's a quote here: would amount to a perpetual covenant of war against every people, tribe, and state owning a foot of land between here and Tierra del Fuego, which is the most southern tip of South America. The secessionists left for a number of reasons. They rejected, or they were primarily related to the issue of slavery. They were alarmed by the political balance that was tipped against them. They were dismayed by the new Republican Party, and they were wary of free soil criticism, of the abolitionist nagging, and the Northern interference in their politics. All we ask is to be let alone, declared Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The Southern secessionists were sure that the departure would be unopposed. Northern manufacturers and bankers depended on Southern cotton and markets for sale. If independent, the South could develop its own banking and shipping and trade directly with Europe and rid itself of the high tariffs that the North put on imported goods. Friction pitted North against South, and nationalism was fermenting in the South, not so much as a section, but as a sub-nation. The principles of self-determination seemed to be applying directly to them, because wasn't it only 80 years before that the 13 original states had voluntarily entered the Union? And now 11 southern states were voluntarily withdrawing from it to go their own path. The historical parallels ran even deeper here. There was originally 13 American colonies, and they had seceded from the British Empire. In this case, the South saw themselves as breaking free of the new king, Lincoln. But we'll have to see what happens next in the next chapter when the nation goes to war. Well, we did that in just about an hour. I want to remind you of your assignments that are due. You should be turning those in the Google Classroom, and I check them whenever you get them, although I may not necessarily put a grade on them right away. Make sure that you are looking at those questions that I've been posting, because you will see those questions again. If you have any questions, make sure you email me or shoot me a reminder or something like that, and I will try to get a reply to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.